In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create these 3 different procedural metal materials. And then after we create each procedural material, I'll show you how to join them together into a custom node group so they have customizable sliders. So the first one here is this smooth metal material. So I'll just zoom into this material. So we have the scale to change the size of the texture there on the smooth metal. Then we also have the base color of the metal, so you can make it like brighter or darker. And then we also have the metallic value. And something you can do with this metal material, which is really cool, is you can turn the metallic value down and then you can turn the base color down. And if you do that, it actually kind of looks like a plasticky material with a little bit of surface imperfections. So that's pretty cool as well if you wanted to create kind of like a plastic material. Then we also have the detail level of that texture. Then we have the roughness of the material to make it more rough or more shiny. And then we also have the bump strength. So it is a smooth metal, but if you want to make it really rough, you could turn up that bump strength. Then we have the second material here, and this one is a brushed chrome material. So we have the scale again to change the size of the material. Then we also have the base color of the material, so you can change that there. Then we also have the metallic value, and if you turn the metallic value down, it still looks pretty cool. It kind of looks like a metal material because we are using some clear coat. And then we also have the detail level, so detail level 1 and also detail level 2. And then we also have the roughness of the material. So actually, if you turn the roughness all the way up to 2, you can see it's very rough, but because there's still that clear coat, it gives a really cool look of the material. It almost looks like a cool car paint or something like that. So you can change the roughness right there. And then there's also the bump strength if you want to make it more bumpy or smooth. And then we also have the X, Y, and Z rotation values, so you can rotate the texture of the brushed chrome. Then we have this cool clear coat, so this is going to add an extra layer of shininess on the surface, and then also the clear coat roughness, and then also the clear coat tint. And then the last material here is this anisotropic metal. And so this is the type of material that you might see on the bottom of a cooking pot or a cooking pan. You can kind of see there's those little circles there going around. And then we have that cool anisotropic shading there. And so that's why I added it to this cylinder object so you can see what it might look like on the bottom of a pan or a pot. So we have the scale for this entire material. Then we also just have the line scale, so you can add more lines or less lines. And then we also have this base color for the metal. Then we also have the metallic value. And then we also have 2 detail levels, so detail level 1 and 2. And then we have the anisotropic amount, so you can have there be less of it or more of it. So this is more like a regular metal, and then this is the anisotropic. And then we have the anisotropic rotation. So if you rotate this around, it's kind of rotating around how that reflection is pointing. And then we also have the roughness of the material, and then we also have the bump strength if you want to make the strength of the metal more bumpy. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase these procedural materials, you can purchase them on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, and also the Blender Market. I'll have the product links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also purchase my procedural material packs, which are packs of 10 materials, and you can get any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube to learn how to create more materials. And then one more thing before we start, I wanted to let you know about a really great Blender add-on for easy, fast texture baking. Oven is an amazing Blender add-on for speeding up the baking process. Start by UV unwrapping your objects. You can then select the objects that you want to bake. You can then choose what maps to bake, like the color, roughness, normal, metallic, and more maps. Then choose your preferred settings, like where to export the textures, the file name, file type, and texture size. Then hit bake, and the add-on will automatically bake all the textures and export them to your computer. Then click the Recreate Materials button, and the add-on will automatically replace the material with a new material using the bake textures. You can find my full add-on review video with the link in the description, and by purchasing through my link, you'll be helping to support this channel. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I first just went to the add menu and I added an icosphere, and then right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I just turned the subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I shaded the object smooth. Then I scaled the object down by a 0.2, pressed Ctrl A and applied the scale, and I moved this over here and then duplicated it so that there were 2 of them. And then for the other object, I went to the add menu and added a cylinder, and I scaled the cylinder down and applied the scale, and then also kind of flattened it and moved it over here and then rotated it over to the side, kind of like this. And then I went into edit mode and I went to the vertex select, and I just selected that loop there and pressed Ctrl B to add a bevel. I can scroll my mouse out to change the amount of bevel there, and then hold down the Alt key, select that part there, Control B, and just add a bevel right there. And then I'll use the object context menu and shade it smooth. And then I also pressed Control 2 to add a subdivision surface modifier with 2 levels. Then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And if you select the camera and go here to the object data properties of the camera, I turned the camera's focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom everything in a bit and make it look a bit more flat. So I'll go into the rendered viewport mode, and I am going to be using the Cycles rendering engine. So here on the render properties, I'm going to be using Cycles, but you could definitely use Eevee if you want to. Here's the materials in Blender Eevee, so they do look pretty good in Blender Eevee as well. So if you want to use Eevee, you can definitely do that. So for the lighting, I added this light right back here. So if you go to the add menu, you can go down here to light and add an area light. And then if you go to the light settings, you can turn up the X size and the Y size. And I made it kind of a long light just to add kind of a rim light in the background. And I turned the power to 10. And then I also duplicated it and made another light right here and scaled this one up a bit to add kind of another backlight. And also to get some nice realistic lighting or reflections, I went here to the world properties and I added in this acoustical shell 1K HDRI from polyhaven.com. So this is a free HDRI, and I'll have the link in the video description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. And then once you download it, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color. You can choose environment texture and then just click on the open button and open up the downloaded HDRI. And let's go back up here to the render properties. So I'm using the Cycles rendering engine. And if I open up the film tab here, I'm going to check mark the transparent button so the background is transparent. And then also I'm going to open up the color management here, and I'll be using the view transform of AGX and the look to very high contrast to make the colors look nicer. So I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here, and then I have the shader editor right over here, and I'll just make this smaller so I have more space. So I'm going to select the first object, let's click on new to add a new material, and I'll rename this to Smooth Metal. And then I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on, so if you don't have that enabled, you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and then over here on the add-ons tab, if you go to the search, you can search for Node and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'm going to start off by going to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop it here. And then to use the feature of the Node Wrangler, if you select a texture, you can press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So we're going to put the object into the vector. And then let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. We can change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 2, and I'll turn the detail all the way up to 10, and then I'll turn the roughness all the way up to 1. So now I want to box select these nodes and kind of bring them back a bit because I want to add another texture here to distort the noise texture. So I'm going to duplicate this noise texture, and I can just drop it right down here between the mapping and the noise. And then we'll change the settings for this noise. So I'll turn the scale to 3, I'll leave the detail at 10, and the roughness I'll turn to a 0.45. But then I want this noise texture to have less of an effect over the first noise texture, so it's not distorting it quite as much. So I'm going to go to the search, and I'll search for a mix color, and I'll put that between the two noise textures. Now we can take the color here, and we're going to put that into color B, and then we're going to take the original mapping, which isn't distorted at all, and we're going to put that into color A. And then here on the mix type, we're going to change this to linear light, and that way when I drag the factor around, the texture will be distorting it, but it won't be moving quite around so much. So if I turn the factor all the way down to 0, you can see it's just that original noise, so it's not distorted. But if I turn the factor up, it's going to be more and more distorted. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.03, so it's just distorted a little bit. And then I'll box select these nodes and bring them back a bit, and I'm also going to have another texture which will distort these two. So for this, I'll go to the add menu, I'll search for a Voronoi and drop it here, and I can plug the vector into the vector of the Voronoi. Let's Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it, and I'll change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 20, and I'll turn the detail to 10, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So let's select the linear light, and I'll duplicate it, and we'll stick it right here in between the Voronoi and this first noise. And we're going to put the vector, we're going to put that into color A, and then we're going to take the Voronoi distance, and we're going to put that into color B. So now we can use the factor to blend between the mapping which isn't distorted and the Voronoi which is distorted. So now the linear light result, that can go into the vector of the first noise. So now we have the Voronoi distorting the first noise, and then the first noise distorting the second noise. So let's Control Shift and select it to preview it. So now here on this linear light, I can drag the factor to control the amount of distortion, and I'm going to turn it up to a 0.3. So now we have a really cool, interesting texture there. If you kind of zoom way in, you can see how it looks, and you can of course change the detail levels and the factor sliders if you want to customize that and kind of make it look different. but it's very gray right now. So to make it more contrasty, after this noise here, I will search for a color ramp. We'll put it here after the noise, and then I can drag the black tab and drag the white tab, and now you can really see what it's doing. So we have a pretty interesting texture there. And then this white tab here, I'm going to make it a gray color. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 6 A's. So I'll drag the black tab a little bit farther back, and then the white tab or the lighter tab kind of right there. So we now have that really cool texture, and you can see it's very detailed. So now we're going to use this as the roughness. So some parts are more rough and other parts are more shiny, depending on how black and white it is. So I'll put the color into the roughness, and I'll Control Shift and select the principled shader. And then also let's turn the metallic value all the way up to 1 so it looks like metal. And then as for the base color, I'm going to make this a grayish color, and the hex value for this is going to be B4, B4, B4. That's the color for the base color, but you can of course change it to whatever you want. And then later on in the custom node group, I want to be able to control the roughness values. So what we're going to do is search for a hue saturation value, and we're going to put this between the color ramp and the principled shader. That way, this value here, this slider is going to make it lighter or darker because it's controlling the value. So that's going to control how rough or shiny it is. So we'll use that later in the custom node group. And then also I want to put a little bit of value into the normal to give it a little bit of bump. So we're going to take this noise texture color, let's put that here into the normal. And one thing that I also want to do is instead of using the factor, let's use the color here of the noise texture. So I'll put the color into the factor of that color ramp right there. So now the color is also going here into the normal, but you can see there's some weird shading issues. It looks really dark. That's because we need to convert the color data into normal data. So to do this, we're going to add a bump node, and we're going to put the bump node between the noise and the normal. Just bring it down here, and the color is going to go into the height value of the bump. So now it looks really bumpy, but I'm going to turn this bump strength way down to a 0.01, so it's very subtle, but you can of course turn that up if you want to be more rough. And that's it for the first procedural material. So let's now join it together into a node group. So I'll click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and you can press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. Now if I hit the tab key, that'll go in and out of the node group with the node group selected. So I'll drag the node group over here, and let's drag the back out to make it bigger, and I'll copy the material name, paste it here into the node group. And then I'll go into the node group by hitting the tab key. Let's hit the N key to open up the side panel. And if we go here to the group tab, we have the group sockets. And I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it shader. So now outside the node group, you can see that socket is called shader. So we'll go back into the node group, and I now want to add up all the custom values. So I first want to control the scale of the textures. So the mapping node is plugged up to all the textures, so we can put the mapping scale into the extra socket. And then if I click on the scale, I want to make it 1 value instead of 3. So we'll change the type here to float. And then on the default value, I need to turn that to 1, but the texture is still missing. That's because we need to go outside the node group, and we need to turn the scale back to 1. So let's go back into the node group. Now let's drag the node group way over here, and I want to plug the base color up to the group input, and then also the metallic value up to the group input. And then I want to control the detail levels. So if I drag this back over here above the textures, all these textures have detail levels of 10. So if I put the detail into the extra socket, and then put this detail into the same socket, and then this detail into the same socket, that'll control all detail values at once of all the textures. And then also, if you wanted to change the distortion, you could kind of drag this around and drag this one around. So if you wanted to, you could put those into the extra sockets there, but it doesn't change the look of the material too much. So I'm not going to add those in there, but you could definitely add these factors kind of as distortion values. Let's also add the roughness. So if we drag this over here to the hue saturation value, we can plug the value into the extra socket and then rename this to roughness. And then finally, let's plug up the bump strength. So we'll put the bump strength into the extra socket there. Double click on this to rename it, and we'll call it bump strength. All right, I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. We'll drag the group input back here, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group. We can now just review the material. So we have the scale value, then we also have the base color, we also have the metallic value and the detail, and then the roughness, and then also the bump strength. So this is just a very simple, smooth metal material, and it's great for adding onto lots of different metal objects. So let's now do the second material. So I'll just go over here to the other sphere. We'll select this. Let's hit new to add a new material. And this material I'll rename to brushed chrome. So for this material, I'll start by adding a noise texture. We'll drop it here. Let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And with the noise texture selected, I'll press Control T to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And again, we're going to plug the object into the vector, so it's using the object coordinates. So we'll change the noise texture settings. So I'll turn the scale to 15. Let's also turn the detail all the way up to 15, but then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I want to stretch the noise texture, so I'm going to select the mapping and duplicate it and put another mapping over here. That way we can use this mapping scale here to change the size of the entire material, but then this other mapping here can be used to stretch the texture. So here on the X scale, I'm going to turn this up to an 80. You can see the X scale is going to stretch it on the X axis. So if we turn it up to 80, it's going to stretch the texture or squish it down. So now we have that cool brushed chrome look. So I now want to put the factor into the roughness, and I'll Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. And let's turn the metallic value all the way up to 1. And I'm going to make the base color a nice gray color, and the hex value is going to be 818181 of the base color. Now that does look pretty cool, but I want to change the colors a little bit so that I can control the roughness. So I'm going to search for a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp after the noise, and then also later on in the custom node group, we'll want to be able to control the roughness. So we'll add a hue saturation value after the color ramp. So this value here will control the roughness because it'll make it brighter or darker. So now here on the color ramp, we can change the colors. So we'll first make it more contrasty by dragging this black tab here, and we can drag the white tab over here. But then I'm going to make them kind of like some grayish colors so that it's not quite as sharp and it's a bit more gray, so you can kind of see it's more shiny. So this first color here, this is going to be a hex value of 646464, and then this other one, the lighter one, this will be a hex value of B4 B4 B4. But of course you can change it, make it lighter or darker to control how rough or shiny you want it to be. And then I also want to add a little bit of bump, so we're going to take the color here, we'll put that into the normal, and then to convert it to bump data, we need to add a bump node, and we'll put this between the noise texture and the normal. And we'll drag this down here. And we want the color to be going into the height value. So now you can see it's really bumpy. So we'll turn the bump strength down to a 0.01, so it's very subtle, but you can of course make that stronger if you want to. And then finally, I want to add a little bit of clear coat. So we'll open up the coat tier. We'll turn the coat weight all the way up to 1. And this is going to add an extra level of shininess. You can kind of see how that shiny that is. And then this roughness here, I'll turn to a 0.1. So that's it for this material. So I'll select the material, I'll hit Control G to join it together into a node group. We can first start by plugging up the scale. So this mapping node here is plugged up to the texture, so we can put the scale into the extra socket here. Let's hit the N key to open up the side panel, and I can double click on this and I'll rename it to shader. And then also on the scale here, I want to click on the type and I want to change it to float instead, so it's just one value. And then we need to turn the default value to 1. And then if we go outside of the node group, we want to turn the scale back to 1. Let's also drag the back of it out a bit, and we're going to drag it over here next to the material output. And we can copy the name and we can paste it here into the node group. So let's go back into the node group now, and we can add up the other custom values. So I also want to control the base color, so we'll drag the group input over here, and we'll put the base color into the extra socket, and then also we'll put the metallic value into the extra socket. And then I want to control the detail values, so we'll drag this behind the noise, and I can put the detail into the extra socket, and then this roughness, this also kind of controls the detail, so I'll put that into the extra socket. And so this one I'm going to rename to detail 1, and then the second one I'll rename to detail 2. And then let's control the roughness, so we'll put this value here from the hue saturation value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to roughness. And then I want to control the bump strength, so we'll put the strength into the extra socket there, and I'll just rename this to bump strength. Then I also want to be able to control the rotation of the texture in case I want that angle there of the brush chrome to be in a different rotation. So to do this, we can take this rotation from the mapping and we can put that into the extra socket. And now if I go outside the node group, you can see we have this rotation value, the X, Y, and Z, to kind of rotate it so we can change it depending on the rotation of the material and how we want it to be rotated on the object. So we'll go back into the node group. And then I also want to control the coat. So we'll drag this down here, and we'll first take the weight, put that into the extra socket, and the roughness, put that into the extra socket. And then also the tint, I will put that into the extra socket just in case we want to control that. And then let's open this up a bit bigger. So I want to rename this to clear coat weight. And then also I'll rename this to clear coat roughness. And then this one I'll rename to clear coat tint. All right, I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. We'll put the group input back here, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group. And we can now review the material. So we have the scale of it. Then we also have the color. We also have a metallic value, and we have 2 levels of detail. We also have the roughness of the material, and actually making it really rough looks pretty cool. And then we also have the bump strength. Then we can change the rotation of the brush texture. And then we have the clear coat roughness, and then finally the clear coat tint. Alright, so let's select the final object here. I'll zoom into the object. Let's add a new material, and I'll call this the Anisotropic Metal. So for this material, I'm going to start by adding a noise texture. So let's add a noise texture right here, and then I'll press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and let's use the object coordinates. So we'll put the object into the vector, and I'm going to drag these back a bit. So let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it, and I'll change some of the settings. So I want to turn the scale up to 500, and why I'm turning this up so big is because all this noise here is what's going to make those lines going around in a circle that kind of looks like on a bottom of a pot or a pan. And then I'll turn the detail all the way up to 15 so it's detailed. Now to give the look of the lines which are rotating around in a circle, we're going to add a gradient texture, and we're going to put the gradient through the vector. And that way the gradient will distort the noise texture, so the noise will be rotating around and it'll look like that kind of lines that is rotating around. So let's add a gradient texture, and we're going to use the same vector here, so we'll put that into the vector. Let's Control Shift and select the gradient to preview it, and right now you can see it's just white and black. And also one thing to mention, if I go into edit mode and then select the object and move it around, you can see depending on where the object is relative to the object's origin point, it's going to be lighter or darker. So you do want to make sure that the object's origin is about in the very center here, because if it's like way over to this side or way over to that side, it's going to mess up the gradient. Now here on the gradient type, instead of it being linear, I'm going to change it to the spherical instead. And this way it's basically going to be a big sphere, and again this will depend on the placement here, because if I like rotate this over or move it over or scale it up, you can see there's the gradient. So if I move it way over here, if it's far away from the origin, it's going to mess up where the gradient is. So make sure the origin point is in the very center of the object. You can also just click on Object and Set Origin, and then click on Origin to Geometry. So I just have the origin kind of right here, but it is in the center. So now what I need to do is I need to put the gradient into the noise to distort it. So we'll put the gradient color into the vector, and let's Control Shift and select the noise to preview it. So now you can see that because the gradient gets lighter and lighter as it gets into the center, that is distorting the noise, so we have those lines there. However, I don't want them to be super distorted. I want it to be a little bit less distorted so you can see a little bit more of the noise. So I'm going to add the mix color. We'll put the mix color between the gradient and the noise here. And I'm going to put the mapping vector into color B. And then we're going to put this gradient color into color A. And on the mix type here, let's change this to linear light. So now the factor, if I turn it all the way to 0, it's fully distorting it using the gradient. But if I turn the factor up more and more, it's going to use more of just the noise. Or it's not going to be distorted because it's using the mapping. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.004, so it's a very small value. But if you zoom in a little bit, it's just not quite as distorted as much. And you can also drag this if you want it to be more distorted and less distorted. So you could even change it to maybe like a 0.04 or something, but I'm just going to keep it at a very small number. So now let's change the colors. So I'm going to add a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp after the noise. Let's also bring these nodes over here. And I want the color ramp color to be going into the roughness to control the roughness. And let's Control Shift and select the principled shader. And I can turn the metallic value all the way up to 1 so it looks like metal. And I'm also going to make the base color kind of like a light gray. And the hex value for the base color will be C1, C1, C1. So now we can change the colors of the color ramp. So what I'm first going to do is make them a little bit more contrasty by dragging them out a little bit. And then I'm going to make this black color kind of like a dark gray. And the hex value will be 64, 64, 64. And then this lighter one here, this is going to be a bit of a light gray. And the hex value for this is going to be 6As. And then let's also go to the Add menu, and we're going to search for a hue saturation value. And we'll put this here after the color ramp. And then we can have this value here to make it lighter or darker. Now we can also put a little bit of value into the bump, so we'll take the noise texture factor, we'll put that into the normal, and then to convert it to bump data, just like we've done before, we're going to add a bump node, we'll put it between the noise and the principled, and then the noise texture factor can be going into the height value to convert it to bump data, and then on the strength, I'll turn this down to a 0.01, so it's very subtle, but you can of course turn this up more if you want. So now to make this look like the anisotropic metal, what we're going to do is open up the specular here, and the anisotropic is kind of hidden here in the specular settings, so we're going to turn the anisotropic all the way up to 1, and then if you want to, you can change the rotation, but I'm just going to leave it set to 0. Now if I zoom zoom really close in here and take a look at this texture, you can see that the lines are really small here, but then they kind of get really big here, and I don't really like how that looks. So what I'm going to do is drag the texture coordinate back, and I'm going to duplicate this mapping and stick it here so we have 2 mapping nodes. So now here on the first mapping, I can change the scale. So I'm going to click on the scale here and click and drag down and then let go, and this will change all values at the same time. And I'm going to change this value to a negative 3.62, so a negative 3.62. Now you might be wondering where I'm getting that scale value. Basically what I did is I just clicked and dragged down, and then I dragged back and forth, and that changed the scale of that gradient. Now if I control shift and select the gradient to preview it, if I click down and then drag and then scale this, you can see if it just turned to like 0, it's very white all around, but if I drag it down more and more into the negative values, you can now see that gradient a lot better. So I'm just going to drag it to something around there, and that way it's kind of black over here and white over here. So if I now control shift and select this color ramp and kind of zoom in here, you can see that texture definitely looks a lot better and the lines are smaller. So if I control shift and select the principled shader there, that just looks quite a bit better. So we can now join this together into a custom node group. So I'll box select these nodes, accept the material output. I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. Let's hit the tab key to go out of the node group, and I'll drag the node group over here next to the material output. Let's make it bigger, and then I can copy the material name and paste it here into the node group. So we'll hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open the side panel, and I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to shader. So now we can take the group input and we can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So I'll put the scale here from this first mapping into the extra socket here. Let's click on the scale, and instead of it being 3 values, I want it to be 1. So we'll take the vector type and we'll change that to float instead. And then I'll turn the default value back to 1. And I'll hit the tab key to go out of the node group, and we need to turn the scale back to 1. So I can now go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the line scale, so that's going to be controlled here by the noise texture. So you can see I can change the scale of this, and that's going to add more and less lines. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to line scale. And then I want to control the color, so we'll drag the group input over here. Let's put the base color into the extra socket, and also let's put the metallic into the extra socket. And then I want to control the detail values, so we'll put this back here behind the noise, and we can put the detail into the extra socket, and also the roughness into the extra socket. And then let's rename these, so I'll call this detail 1, and then this will be called detail 2. And then I'll drag the group input right down here. Let's take the anisotropic and put that into the extra socket, and then the anisotropic rotation, put that into the extra socket. And then let's also take this hue saturation value here. We'll take the value, we'll put that into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and this will be called roughness because it's controlling the brightness and darkness to control how rough it is. And then finally, we'll put the bump strength here into the extra socket. I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll call it bump strength. So I'll hit the N key to close the side panel, we'll drag the node group back here, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside the node group. We can now review the final material, so we have the overall scale. You can see if you turn it down, it kind of gets rid of that texture, and that's because it's scaling the gradient. So you might want to just turn this up, but you probably don't really want to turn it down because it'll get rid of it. But you can turn it down if you need to, or you can just change the line scale. That might be better. Just change the line scale so you can have more lines or less lines. Then we have the base color, so you can make this brighter and darker. You can also make it more and less metallic. And then we also have 2 detail levels to change the detail of the lines. We also have the anisotropic and the anisotropic rotation, so you can kind of rotate this around to change the rotation of that shading, and that kind of looks like a propeller blade on an airplane spinning around. Then we also have the roughness of the material to make it really shiny or rough. And then finally we have the bump strength. And that is it. So that is how you create these 3 different procedural metal materials. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you're easily able to follow along, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, you can purchase these project files with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the Blender Market. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack to purchase all of my materials, and my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And you can also check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist to learn how to create more procedural materials. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.